When making an offer, is it a good idea to ask the other party to pay for your closing costs? We'll talk about that coming up next. Hey, what's going on, friends? This week we're going to talk about closing costs and what they are, and if it's a good idea or strategy to ask the other side to pay for closing costs. And the important thing to understand about closing costs is you have to specify what you're talking about. In a contract, you want to be very specific about what you're asking the other side for. And a lot of times we'll have a buyer or seller say, yeah, I'll take the offer, but I want the other guys to pay for the closing costs. And we're not sure what you mean by that, right? So I'm going to always ask that second question. What do you mean by closing costs? Because depending on what part of the transaction you're looking at and the different fees involved in a transaction, closing costs can mean different things to different people. So for example, lenders have closing costs. If you're getting a loan on the property, you're going to have some funding fees, maybe some appraisal costs, some points if you're buying down points. There could be some other lending closing costs involved with that. And those are strictly to do with your loan, right? It has nothing to do with the property. And so is that something that you want to ask the seller to pay for? If you are a buyer, you got to consider that. Some other standard costs that you're going to have in every transaction are escrow fees, right? You're going to have the escrow processing fee. You're going to have title insurance fees. You may have some service fees to do notary services if they got to come to your place of business or property in order to get paperwork signed. Are those things that are appropriate to ask the other side to pay for? You have to evaluate that and see if it makes sense. Do you really want the other side to pay for the notary to come to you for your convenience to sign documents? That's a closing cost, and you gotta take that into consideration. And then there's also other closing costs like transfer taxes, prorations on homeowners insurance or homeowner HOA fees, all kinds of other things that may be assessments, things like that, that may be part of closing costs that are prorated when you close, and you have to decide, okay, what is appropriate for me to pay for or for the other side to pay for. So those are all things that you want to think about and consider. And all of this is broken down in paragraph F of our Hawaii purchase contract. There's some standard breakdowns. You can always modify those, but there's some standard breakdowns to kind of understand who pays for what customarily, because some of these costs are primarily seller costs or buyer costs. And then one of the biggest closing costs, if you just put closing costs in quotation marks, are real estate commissions, right? That is a closing cost that the seller has to pay. And so if a seller says, I want the buyer to pay all the closing costs, do they also mean the real estate commissions? Because customarily that's paid for by the seller. So it really depends on what side of the transaction you're looking at, the different parties involved, and you really want to take into account the strategy on what makes sense. Because if you're making an all cash offer on a property and then you want the other side to pay closing costs, the seller to pay closing costs, it's really just cash back to you, right? So maybe you just ask for a little bit off the purchase price, or you ask for a credit back at closing for a specific amount. And that's definitely what I always recommend, is that if you're going to ask for some type of concession, you ask for a specific amount. Because if you leave an open-ended, I want you to pay for closing costs, the other side has no idea exactly what that means. You may be able to get an estimate from escrow, but everybody's always going to feel better agreeing to a contractual term that is specific, right? I want $3,000 in title and escrow fees covered in closing costs, something like that, that will be more specific and easier for everybody to understand. Escrow, the lender, and the other side that is on the transaction. So closing costs can be complicated, but it's not as simple as watching HGTV and this negotiation where I want the other side to pay for closing costs. Because if you're not specific about it, you can run into contractual mess and a lot of confusion and debate later on, which could cause a lot of heartache and headache in your transaction. So all stuff to think about before you go and ask for closing costs. Have a discussion with your realtor, break it all down, figure out what makes sense. There are situations where it makes absolute sense. If you're doing a VA loan or a USDA loan and you have very little money to put down and you need that cash cost to be covered at closing, that's something that you can negotiate into the deal. Maybe offer full price because they're going to give you a $5,000 concession on closing costs, or maybe in a hot market you have to offer above asking price in order to get a $5,000 commission or $5,000 or $10,000 concession on closing costs to make the loan program work if you don't have a lot of out-of-pocket cash. So every situation is different. You really want to take everything into account and make a smart decision that is going to make that deal come together and be a win-win for everybody, instead of just arbitrarily asking for closing costs. So I hope that helps. If you have any questions, you can always put them in the comments below or email me at dylan@buybigisland.com and I'll get back to you. Aloha.